Professor, and I'm Professor of International Economic Law here at the University of Leeds, and I specialise in international trade regulation, particularly as it relates to agriculture and trade. And it's an honour for me today to welcome you to the 9th virtual seminar of the Global Food and Environment Institute. And our seminar today is called Seasonal Workers Across Borders, Farming Needs, COVID-19 Pandemic and Immigration After Brexit, which will be presented by my colleague, Dr Roxana Barbulescu. Roxana is an associate professor in the School of Sociology and Social Policy here at Leeds, and her areas of expertise focus on migrant communities and practices of migration and mobility, particularly in connection with migrants and refugees' rights, citizenships, intra-EU mobility and migration control. She's a social scientist with an interest in policy interventions and a particular enthusiasm for comparative research. She's the author of the research monograph, Migrant Integration in a Changing Europe, currently published with University of Notre Dame Press, and she is the PI on a UKRI ESRC funded project called Feeding the Nation, Seasonal Migrant Workers and Food Security during COVID-19 pandemic. I want to say a little bit more about the seminar series itself. So the seminar series is part of the Global Food and Environment Institute seminar series, and you can check out further seminars in our series on our website, through Eventbrite, and also through our Twitter feed. And the Institute itself is an interdisciplinary research community that brings together members from across academia, industry and public policy to work on the integrated challenges of food security and climate change. Now, before I introduce Roxana, I'd like to remind everyone of seminar etiquette. It's on your screen as well. So please keep your cameras and your microphones switched off for the duration of the seminar. Roxana is going to speak for about 20 minutes. So if you've got any comments or questions for Roxana, please put them in the chat. Hopefully we'll have about 10 minutes at the end of this session for a Q&A, and I'll collate the questions, and then Roxana is going to reply to them. Can I remind everyone that the seminar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available via YouTube. Okay, so without more ado, I want to hand over to Roxana to give today's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, for the wonderful introduction to my project. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation to present with colleagues at Global Food and Environment Institute. This is an especially important opportunity for me because I usually engage with people that work with people with expertise in migration studies. So I really welcome the opportunity to address and have this conversation with people who focus on food and environment studies. So what I will discuss today comes essentially from a project funded by the UKRI and ESRC, as Fiona mentioned earlier. This is a project that is under the COVID-19 scheme, is part of that particular scheme, so it has a specific focus as well. And I wanted to mention that it's not just a personal project, there is an entire team behind, and I wanted to introduce you to the team as you can see them on the slide. We also have a Twitter feed that if you're more if you want to follow up how the project develops and what we do, please check our Twitter feed and our website. And just to say that we have, so there I work with my colleagues, but also there is an artistic illustrator who works on the project with us and collaborates with us. So what I will try to, I wanted to first state the challenge. So we will spend a little bit in the first part of the presentation. We'll go and spend a bit more time on slides, and in the second part, I will start to introduce more data and we'll go faster. So please bear with me. What I wanted to first introduce to you is the challenge. Locally produced fruit and vegetable is highly dependent on seasonal migrant workers, not seasonal workers in general. Seasonal workers tend to be migrants. In the UK, the percentage is over 90%, the latest data that we are aware of, and measured against any yardstick, this is a high percentage of dependency. So the project is set at the core of that, particularly as the pandemic brought in new challenges, how to sustain the agri-food supply chain throughout the pandemic, how to support it and ensure that it is working properly and there are no disruptions on one hand, but also how to bring people safely across the borders in the middle of the pandemic. And I will say a few more about this, more specific around the pandemic in the latest slides, but I just wanted here to introduce what are the conversation and the challenges that this particular project seeks to contribute to. And any solutions that investigate how to support this problem will have implications for greater challenges and also important debates in our contemporary societies. One is, and what I've done here is to map these challenges and according to the level of impact. So I've mapped here global challenges, challenges for the global north, so for developed nations, and particularly specific challenges for Britain, for the UK. And the first are that this is also an opportunity, and in addressing this problem, we have to think and reimagine more resilient agri-food supply chains and ensure food security to feed the populations through in any time. But we also have to think more in developing preparedness and introducing these elements across the food systems. And these are global challenges. They don't pertain to a particular country. This problem also, this challenge also has implications for automation and future of work if we are to move into more technological-based solutions to agriculture. It also has implications for health, the health of populations, and also for environmental and global change and climate change agenda in conversations with the sustainable diet, particularly as the population is increasing. And it is increasing at an accelerated pace in particular locations around the world. But there are also questions around food miles, and I will say a few words about that later, because when we talk about food miles, we don't consider where the workers come from. We don't consider the miles of the workers. And questions around plant-rich diets. I didn't, and you have to mention here, you have to observe here, the difference is not plant-based diet, but plant-rich diet. For the global north, more developed nations in the Northern Hemisphere, there is also a particular demographic challenge, and this is at the heart of migration studies as well. There is an aging population and the lack of a working age population to fill in all the sectors. And the native population moves into more attractive sectors with better pay and better progression opportunities. So there is that demographic question in the global north. And with this question around diet as well, it contributes to healthy aging societies in the north. It's a question of also supporting by the solutions to tackle this challenge of seasonal workers in the global north. It's also it provides and it contributes to supporting the national farming sector. Essentially, because for developed nations, this means that you could easily import food from elsewhere. And then you would not have to worry about workers, where they come from, their welfare, their organizing all the well-being and rights system to support that. From migration studies perspective, it's also about a question of having low-skilled opportunity for international migration opportunities for those what they are referred to as low-skilled. so without a professional occupation. But if you would talk to farmers, and we'll say, I'll mention about that later on, they do say that seasonal workers, agricultural workers, are skilled workers from their point of view. But it contributes to that debate, because in the recent years we've seen a reduction of these opportunities for low-skilled migrants, and a concentration for global talent and global race for talent. So high-skilled opportunities for high-skilled migrants. It also contributes to the UK development goals. Why, in particular, in some countries that engage with specific countries of origin? Because there is certainly the remittances and the savings that migrants bring contribute to their development in the countries of origin. For Britain, it also has implications for the Brexit transition, but because, as you will see, as I will mention earlier, there are many questions here, but also the transition from freedom of movement, where farmers were recruiting workers predominantly through freedom of movement, be them here or bring them annually from the countries of origin, to a more visa system, and then recruiting locally, also migrants with settled and pre-settled status who are EU workers, but they are domiciliated in Britain. So having said that, I want, particular to this audience, I wanted to introduce also the question of where does food come in the questions for this particular project. And I believe that it's quite at the center of it, because there is a growing population, and all the healthy diets are predominantly plant rich, and this is a diet recommendation produced by the Eat Lancet Commission. Some of you in the audience may be familiar with that. They've produced and developed a diet that is sustainable, and it can nurture and provide the nutrients and the calories needed for a population of over 10 billion, and that has the lowest environmental impact. So to tackle, it's healthier, has lowest environmental impact, and can feed the entire population. And as you can see here, it's quite, fruit and vegetables contribute a large part of this diet. We're taking over half of the proposed menu, and it's also quite large quantities, thinking that we need to grow all these fruit and vegetables. So I've put here only the fruit and the vegetables. So there are the plant-based nutrients in the plate, like grains, protein, and mushrooms, and seeds, but predominantly the majority is fruit and veg, which means that we are going to need to grow more fruit and vegetables, and fruit and vegetables need workers to pick them and to look after them, and this is a highly seasonal work, particularly in the global north, where the seasons are shorter than elsewhere. So having said that, I wanted to introduce you to these are fruit and veg, a selection of fruit and veg that are grown in the UK and still need human pickers. So a lot of them are soft fruit, which is a particular area of interest here, but not necessarily. And we don't have full technological solutions for this. So we will still depend for a couple of more years, at least, on human workers to pick them. So these are some of them certainly are also, so for some of these fruit and veg we still import, but predominantly they are these are products that we grow in the UK and still rely on migrant workers to do the harvest. So having said that, I'm gonna continue and introduce a little bit of the context and what has done. Then we're getting closer to the findings. So I just wanted to mention, as I kind of introduced earlier on, that this is a feature of most developed nations across the world. So there are special immigration routes, long-standing, all all introduced in the early post-war period that recruit migrant workers to do work in agriculture. And you'll see here the US, Australia, many European countries, and including Poland, for example, that also relies on seasonal workers, migrant workers for agricultural work. In the UK, the seasonal agricultural worker scheme, some people still refer to the current situation with the old name. It was introduced in 1940s, but it was discontinued in 2013. And the reason for that was that what it used to happen is that we traditionally recruited from Eastern Europe, different countries in Eastern Europe. And as the countries were joining the EU and therefore part of freedom of movement, that there was less of a need to recruit through the worker scheme, which is a sector-based scheme, which has implication because in the current moment, we only have one sector-based scheme for immigration in the UK, and this is for agriculture. All the others are organized around professions and shortage occupation list rather than for the sector. And the majority in the last couple of years, the majority of workers came from Romania and Bulgaria. I have some stats in the coming slide. What happened with COVID-19? Well, COVID-19 is recasting a bit how our understanding of seasonal migration in agriculture, and is asking big questions about sustainability and it questions the entire system of seasonal migration for agriculture. Why did it happen so? Essentially because there was also an overlap between the onset of the pandemic, if you remember March, and this is also the start when at the time it coincides with the time when most farmers and labor providers so therefore the recruitment agencies are looking for workers and all starting to organize already their arrival. And so it was that coincidence and overlap of these two processes as UK and all the other countries. Italy, if you remember, started first. Also Spain, Germany, countries with large agricultural sectors, which is not necessarily the case for UK, started to close down the borders and entered into lockdown. And the first lockdown, if you remember, was one of the strictest in terms of restrictions, and still we will see the agricultural workers being flown in the country. So it's recasting many questions around seasonal migration for agriculture, and it also requires answers and policy interventions. And we've seen quite a few of these. And I must say, all countries have been very quick in reacting and introducing measures to support the mobility of seasonal workers. So all they've worked and to help, encourage, promote seasonal work in general from abroad and from local workforce. And what happened in the UK in particular, there's been an exemption for international travel restrictions. So if you remember the isolation period, I will again discuss this a bit later on. In Britain, there was also introduced a Pick for Britain campaign, which has some success, particularly in raising awareness as well. So it contributed to highlight even more the seasonal the dependency on seasonal migrant workers in the sector. And it also introduced and expanded considerably the seasonal worker pilot that was pilot to think and work around how to organize the transition from freedom of movement to point-based system after Brexit, immigration point system after Brexit. And it expanded considerably from 2,500 to 10,000 last year, and increased even further this year. So this is considering the last year. So what happens with the workforce in agriculture? Where do we stand? I didn't include here the historical trend, but there's been a considerable hemorrhage of workforce from agriculture to other sectors. But at the same time as agriculture became more intensive and more productive as well. But we also see, so what you see here is the breakdown around different routes in agriculture, different figures. As you know, farmers and directors and spouses, many times are family members that work in agriculture, are the highest part. The salaried or hired hands, it's also an important part. And then the last two categories would be part-time workers, and these are a sensible part of, a very significant part of agriculture workforce today. So if across the workforce, salaried workforce, 36% are seasonal workers. So seasonal workers, and nearly 14% of the total workers in UK farming. So this is a considerable percentage and workforce element, and also an important element, a vital element in the agri-food supply chain. So how there is a big debate now. Those who are, some of people in the audience who follow the interventions in this area know there is a big debate on what is the demand and for seasonal workers, so to see how to respond and which are the elements that address to fulfill this demand for workers. And as you can see here, this figure is of 64,000 workers. This is a much debated figure, and there is no consensus at the moment on what is the exact demand. There are a couple of reviews ongoing, but there is no exact figure on that. And why are we in this situation? Well, first of all, the agriculture census data, or similar, the DEFRA June survey and similar surveys in the devolved nations, did not collect data on nationality or residence of the agriculture workforce. So we have very detailed, and many people know here, we have very detailed data on outputs and livestock and crops, but we have much poorer data on the workforce on one hand, and secondly, the fact that the seasonal workers was predominantly migrants, or that migrants were part of the workforce, was not included, was not part of the routine data that was collected in agriculture on the workforce. So, and we arrive in a situation that we are in a 90% dependency of migrant workers, but they didn't show up in this routine temperature checks, if you want, and routine data collection that was taking place in agriculture. And that is part of the problem. Then 2016 came, the EU referendum, there is a decision, we're gonna leave, the freedom of movement will end, and then we start seeing data emerging. So we see the farming organization, in particular the British growers and the National Farmers Union, conducting their own survey, annual and the monthly, over the year of 2016. And then it is these figures that are still put forward, and we work with, and they are in the public domain. The British Growers Association estimated the demand for seasonal workers at 75,000, so in horticulture, and the National Farmers Union did a further and much more in-depth report and study on that, and the figure shows the picture of a high dependency, 98–99% to migrant workers, predominantly back then EU migrants, with 2/3 of these Romanian and Bulgarian nationals and 1/3 A8 nationals, so Polish, Slovak, and etc. It's important to stop for a moment here and consider that there are these different assessments, as I suggested earlier. They are not necessarily incompatible, because what does the June survey do? It takes, it's a picture at a moment in time, so rather than throughout the year, which means that throughout the year could potentially be more. I would also add an extra element of caution here that it can be higher. Why? Because of the low retention rate, and this is something that we find in our research. Quite it's one of the really systemic issues for them. It's recruitment, but then retention is the issue. So then, if you need more people, you constantly need more people, then the demand is higher. So it's also a question of what is demand. Is the demand of the number of workers or the number of people that you want to bring in the sector to do the work? So now we're moving on. What has happened and how is this demand addressed? Where does it come from? So if you remember, there were large numbers for 2016. They need the evaluation of 75,000 or the different number of 64,000. In 2020, while the UK has already left the EU, there was this transition year and freedom of movement continues unchanged. So in 2020, people were still recruiting workers via the freedom of movement from the EU. There were also 10,000 visas issued. Not all of them were used last year. There was a delay, particularly because in the second semester, in the second quarter of 2020, it was really difficult to process visas for home office and in countries of origin. And last year, we also had the Peak for Britain campaign. The success of this campaign is relatively low, around 10%, at some points in time lower. Some estimates are lower, but it had these three components. Where are we in 2021? In 2021, the situation has changed. There is recruitment taking place via, for EU workers that now have settled and pre-settled status. We also have 13,000 visas available this year. And there is also a collaboration now with the Department for Work and Pensions to bring people in the sector. And we will see the success that this will have. Right, so now we're moving on into more the experiences of migrant workers in agriculture. And I would like to start here just to mention that it's extremely important to understand that sometimes when we discuss about seasonal workers, they are pictured as being and working only in the harvest time. And this is not the case. So they are also included and they also work and support the growth, like for example, building Spanish tunnels, glass houses. They do pick fruit and vegetables, but they also pack the fresh produce. And this is also important. Most of the farms also have a pack house that is also dependent on, it's the same workers that work in the pack house. And I would also like to say a few words from the behalf of migrants and what we find in the study, in working, in talking to them. And there is evidence that it remains an attractive sector. First, because of the perceived lower admission requirements, that it wouldn't be, that they would have lower chances to enter the point-based system, but also because it offers accommodation to them that they pay from that is then deducted, but because it comes as a package with work and accommodation, that is still attractive to them, and it's affordable accommodation, which you wouldn't always find easily. And because it enables them to make savings and live apart abroad, but then also return and spend time with their families. So there isn't that full migration separation that comes with wilder labor migration routes. But migrants also speak of the work of being hard, physical work in all weathers. Most of them are not experienced to where they are not used to British weather. Some mention back pain, long hours schedules, particularly when they have to do overtime to fulfill an order, and the emotional cost of leaving families behind. The majority take, and it's important to mention this when we think about seasonal workers, that the majority take up loans to come to the UK, so they are making a personal investment, and they need to repay this. So, and this is sometimes, it depends on the country, but it can be 150% the wage in their country of origin. So it's important when we think about motivations and the investment that they make as well. And on top of this, for example, for the visa, there is also an additional cost with visa, which is not among the most expensive in the world or in Europe, but it also bears a cost, an additional cost. So what else do they say? The salaries are paid on time, and that's good in most of the cases, but there is little understanding among workers of the peculiarities of paid work in agriculture. And some people here may be acquainted and very familiar with the piece rate system, but also the agriculture wage board and how the agriculture system is regulated, which is different than other types of work. It's a very differently regulated sector. And second, they also are not aware with zero-hour contracts, which is the contractual form that seems to dominate the sector. Because in Eastern Europe, there isn't that, there is very little part-time work, and the figure of zero-hour contract doesn't exist. And they would be confused. And this is where it is also questions of exploitation and perception of exploitation. They would be confused. They would say, tomatoes will be paid this much today, and tomorrow there will be a new price. So this rate will change also on demand from supermarkets or overtime, and then the price would change. And that would confuse them. There is no explanation, there is little explanation from supervisors how that was built in, how is that calculated, how does it lead. There is also big concerns about which is the right way to go and the right route to find employment, because there are many dishonest employers out there. And while the operators, for example, of the pilot are strictly regulated, the migrants don't know that. They don't know who are these certified operators that are out there and that are subject to regulation, whereas there are other people that scout and bring them, and that is an issue for them. They also have poor language skills, and because they are the transitory nature of seasonal work, it makes difficult for these workers to familiarize themselves with the working conditions. So what I said earlier about the piece rate system in agriculture, paid work in general, and the zero-hour contract, so it's a fertile ground for exploitation. Shared accommodation on farm is a challenge for workers because of loss of privacy. On some occasions, they are good quality, on others, they are not so good quality. But there is a question of a loss of privacy because the walls are very thin. Sometimes in this work, there are couples that come. And farmers mention the shared accommodation as well, because there is a high cost of maintenance of these caravans. For example, revisions of gas and electric, general high cost to maintain this in adequate quality. And there is seasonal workers. If we are even to trust the highest estimate is 75,000, it's a small group of people, it's a small sector, and they're scattered geographically. It's really difficult to have and to see support in the community across the first sector to support them and then clarify some of these issues and provide them support if issues emerge. And I don't know if we have time, if we still have time. I had one slide here for.
Okay, Roxana, it's Fiona here. We've probably got 1 minute because we're running out of time for Q&A as well. So if you could wrap up, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll move straight to conclusions. I have one slide on the pandemic and what has been done around it. Just to mention that quickly, for migrants, it remains an attractive sector. The savings made while working in a British agriculture help them reach personal and family goals, and many times go in the second generations. They use it for their kids and to support the education of their kids. We need better data, as always, but we really need better data to understand the presence of that. And we need to have this data included in the main agriculture census to understand the demand and the need, and and just to make visible the presence of migrant workers. We need investment and development to develop in a support network around the community. During their stay in the UK, the Scottish government introduced special guidance and the helpline for seasonal workers. And we need to reimagine the agri-food supply chain to prevent exploitation by improving regulations, especially for those on visas, which are more regulated and where we can intervene more easily. There are some solutions out there. So, for example, in the EU, the European Parliament recently is working on what is called and a solution put forward by the unions in agriculture. And it's social conditionality, whereby the welfare and well-being of workers in agriculture is linked to subsidies allocations. Other good practices are around establishing bilateral agreements with countries of origin, and this has multiple benefits. So thank you for coming to the presentation, and I look forward to hear your questions and get in contact if you have more, if you want to follow up.
Thank you, Roxana. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm sure everybody agrees. It's very rich. There's plenty of issues to think about there. So I'm just seeing we're now getting lots of activity in the chat. Thanks to everybody. We've only got a few minutes, so I'm going to collate the questions. One of the things it struck me as you were talking about the overlap between the pandemic and the UK's exit from the EU seem to be, those two things seem to be really a problem for seasonal workers. I just wondered if you'd been able to identify the separate effects of those two issues, or whether they just got lumped together. I wonder whether your project has said any more, and that's certainly a question from Steve as well in the chat. And if you could say a little bit more about the visa scheme. So now, if migrant workers come through the visa scheme, are they then permanently trapped, or is there a process of being able to have settled status and things like that? So if you could deal with those two questions very quickly, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you everyone for the wonderful questions. And please do follow up if you have more questions on the email. I'm very happy to engage. So first, is really important. They did come at the same time, the pandemic and Brexit, but particularly, and it's having more impact now for 2021 because of the end of freedom of movement. So Brexit for seasonal workers, it means the end of freedom of movement in December. This is where the Brexit that matters, let's put it this way. And it again coincided with the second wave in the UK, the third wave, sorry, the third lockdown and the third wave in the UK. So how do we disentangle the two? I think I didn't have the chance to say a few, we didn't have time to go into the effect of the pandemic effect. There were a couple of outbreaks last year, and this year as well, but they were minimum, which means that it worked. But people didn't, we've learned about COVID-19 as we moved along. In the beginning, we didn't know about airborne transmission. There were no masks, there were no safety measures on farms and in shared accommodation. And there was more risk in the beginning. But people still engaged and came last year. And they came especially via the freedom of movement. The visa allocation started, but kicked in later in the year. So we do see in the third and fourth quarter of the year more people coming. Still 24%, 25% of the visa were not used last year because of the pandemic. But it is it's a combined effect of Brexit and the pandemic. And in respect to the visa system, yeah, I can say a few more things about this. So the new visa system is still piloted. That's one of the good news as well. It's in pilot version. There is no route to settlement, so it cannot be extended, and people they could potentially return a second year, but this is does not translate in policy. So there is no recognition or allowance for that. It would be a fully new application. And the operators are licensed. There is a very strict process by DEFRA. This year they were very late in particular with licensing for additional operators. But looking at what happened last year, it may be that if not all visa will be used, a good amount of them will be used as well this year. And they come with many restrictions. For example, you cannot even to take a second job, even within the same farm. And as the system is designed, the employer is not the farmer. So I think this is important to stress. The important is not the farmer, is the operator, so the recruitment agency, not the farmer. They are directly working for the operator. They cannot change employer, but the employer is the operator again. So they can potentially change the site of employment, so different farms, and move across the farms.
That's great. Just sort of interrupted there because I think we've got a couple of questions coming in on the idea of the role of the DWP office that you mentioned, and wonder if you could explain the role, because it seems like it fits in quite well with this question about visas and rights to work.
So thank you for that, and thank you. Hi, Gabriela. I think that's really important. It's a new development. Last autumn, we knew that the Pick for Britain campaign will go forward this year, and this has been changed, and instead there's a cooperation with the WP. So the jobs will be also advertised through WP, and there is a new culture of now organizing and understanding how to work with DWP for farmers. It is to be seen how successful this scheme is as well. It might have, always the problem has been that the geography of where farms are and where unemployed people are. But the COVID-19 also introduced opportunities. So for example, we came across one farmer but it was a small employer, just 20 people, 20 seasonal workers that moved from completely seasonal workers, migrants brought from abroad to local workers through advertising on social media and using apps to open up shifts, and then contracting also under 18, local workers under 18 who had more time available.
Yeah, thanks, Roxana. We just got time for one more question. I see that there is one on the chat. We've got a question here that talks about the publicity about the shortage of workers. We had a lot about that last year, but less so this year. So has that affected recruitment at all to the scheme? Of farmers struggling again this year to recruit seasonal workers?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Last year, it was because of the pandemic and the international restrictions. So last year, the international restriction played a major role in how are we going to bring the workers coming in. Also, the flights were cancelled. We also don't have as many flights this year. So for the workers, because they absorb the cost of transport, it's more expensive to come and less rewarding. So what we see now, it has an impact. Why we see less now? Because the expansion of the visa system, and because there is a reduction in seasonal workers, and particularly now the season that has ended is not on food, but is on flowers, ornamentals, and we've seen there a large shortage. A considerable shortage, up to a third of the workforce that they couldn't recruit. There are still echoes, but they are within the farming industry. So it comes from the industry this year rather than in the national news.
So are they looking further afield, the farmers? Are they looking at different jurisdictions, different geographies, different countries?
That's a really important question, because the farmers are not recruiting directly, it's the operators. There has been a considerable expansion of that, and with last year, because we had this dual system, freedom of movement in parallel to the small visa system, and many now have acquired settled and peaceful status. We still have that, so we have a combination of EU workers and non-EU workers. The operators in the previous years have looked predominantly in the eastern neighborhood, with Ukraine accounting for up to around 90% in 2019 and 2020. But they are expanding, the number of countries is expanding, and that's one possibility. In other countries, they don't tend to do that. They don't tend to have this wide approach. They are more concentrated and recruiting in predominantly a few countries, because then you establish long sustainable relationships with labor inspectorates, with diplomatic service. You can construct a layer of civil society around specific communities, where you cannot if you have 50 countries of origin.
That's really fantastic. I mean, I've got loads of questions myself, and I'm sure we could all sit here and talk to you for hours on this really fascinating topic, but we've run out of time today. I want to thank you, Roxana, for an amazing presentation, and to say again that if anybody wants to contact Roxana, you've made your email available, and to thank everyone for participating today, and thank you for your great questions. And do join us again in our next GFEI seminar. So thanks everybody, and I hope to see you all again soon. All right, bye everyone.
Bye.